afternoon, everybody. We have a wonderful panel with us today who have agreed, I'm hoping you're with us on this, that there's much to talk about looking forward. And our colleagues here today have agreed to give us some of their thoughts. So the original thought about this panel was that knowing what's happening on the ground and how is foundational to achieving a just society. I think, perhaps even more than ever, that that's a concern that we need to bear in mind after this year's bruising election season. Remarkable for some candidates, denial of even the most fundamental and observable facts. It seems oddly appropriate that we should turn our attention today, at least to some extent, to the facts of what's happening and has been happening on the ground, particularly related to healthcare and its delivery generally, but more particularly, and this panel has such wonderful deep background about what's happening, has been happening in women's reproductive health care, which, as I'm sure everybody knows, promises to be an even more intense political firestorm in the days ahead. We are privileged to have 5 journalists here who have researched and reported on some of the most dramatic examples of what's been going on with the opposition to reproductive health care in the U.S. We have with us Sophia, I don't know in what order people are seated, but we have Sophia Resnick from Rewire News, a reporter with Rewire News. Megan Winter, who's on the far end, who is a freelance reporter. Jackie Combs, to my immediate left, who's a reporter with now defunct New York Times.
Oh, we've gone from failed this morning to now we're just defunct.
Right, now that's right, failed, not defunct. Predicted to soon become defunct New York Times. We have Molly Redden, who's a reporter with The Guardian, and Nina Martin, a reporter with ProPublica, who is a co-sponsor, which organization is a co-sponsor of this forum today. And Nina is here in the stead of her colleague Charlie Ornstein, that I'm guessing that she may be able to pass on bits and pieces from what Charlie's work has unveiled as well. But does it make sense to start and just check in with you all about post-election thoughts? Is that just too frontal?
It feels appropriate.
Yeah.
It feels appropriate. All right, well, yeah.
In terms of reproductive rights and women's health?
And women's health.
Okay. Well, I think it's like any other topic related to Donald Trump. There's just a great deal of uncertainty at bottom, and he's been on both sides of the issue, but there's no question he is going to be allied with the conservative forces that are against reproductive rights. And when I say he's been on both sides of the issue, when you take this issue of defund Planned Parenthood, he has spoken up for what he called the good aspects of what Planned Parenthood does. On the other hand, he's also said he would have been willing to shut down the government over defunding Planned Parenthood. So there's that. He's put out his list of more than 20 potential Supreme Court justices, and he has said that a litmus test will be that they strike down Roe. Are in favor of striking down Roe versus Wade. And what's interesting is we've heard this phrase "litmus test" for my entire career, for decades, and but it usually was candidates were quick to deny that they had any litmus tests. But now it's become, I can't underscore enough for you that now it's become, on the right, something that you have to say you're going to do. So I'm no doubt that when he interviews a justice for the Supreme Court, he will out and out ask them, will you support striking down Roe versus Wade? So, and then you combine him with the fact that he now has an all-Republican Congress that's been champing at the bit to, especially on the House side, the Republicans there to defund Planned Parenthood and to, in other ways, throw up obstacles to women and men, for that matter, exercising their constitutional rights, that, you know, they now have a willing partner in the White House. So others can speak more to the Supreme Court, or better than I can. My colleagues tell me it really will take, they're not one vote away, they're effectively 2 votes away. But the next president this term will conceivably, as you probably all are well aware, have the chance to name several members to the Supreme Court, and replacing, in some couple cases, maybe a very liberal member.
Can you hear me okay? Because my ears are like back in Texas, where I was this morning, so I can't actually hear myself very well. I will say that I was really happy to, and I think to have sort of been, I've been working on a project that is very much related to reproductive health, but isn't about abortion. And I was so happy to kind of be in that space for a while, thinking, okay, well, it's not that it's done, but it's not going to be at the top of our national conversation about women's health and politics in the same way that it was at the beginning of this year. And now that's changed. But I do think that, I also think that my reporting, and I think all of us as reporters, are going to find ourselves finally, maybe, in a way that I think is going to be really healthy and important, to think about reproductive health and women's health and maternal health and rights as something that is far beyond abortion. I think that abortion rights and issues have sucked up so much of our attention, our money, and for really important, necessary reasons. But there's so much else to be focusing on. And I've spent enough time in places where you bring up abortion and you just kind of shut down the conversation. And I think that there's a lot of really important conversations, there's a lot of important reporting, a lot of important conversations to have in those places. And I think that they go beyond abortion. And so I'm not trying to say it doesn't matter, or I'm not closing my eyes to that reality, but I just think it's kind of, we've hit a moment where it's, as reporters, and I think we have to really think beyond abortion in a way that we've not maybe done for a while. And I think that's probably, again, for journalism, and maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really smart thought. I think, you know, we were talking a little bit upstairs about how when you start a conversation about abortion, a lot of the fundamentals of what people are debating when they debate abortion, you know, are should women be able to control their bodies, or at least if you're coming from sort of the progressive end of the spectrum, that's what you believe you're talking about when you talk about abortion. And so I think something that this election, I think, revealed is that, you know, when you have this big contested issue, you know, where people start from a baseline of that's up for debate, that sort of bodily autonomy is up for debate, you know, that bleeds into a lot of the ways that we think about women's bodies as a society and from the perspective of law. And I think this election really showed us that, you know, we think a lot about women's bodies, not just in terms of reproductive rights, as, you know, being subject to control. And, you know, it doesn't stop at women's bodies. You know, it goes a lot further. It touches a lot of other people. If I may briefly drag us back to abortion, though, I think, you know, it's absolutely true that with the current composition of the court, you can add Antonin Scalia Part 2, and you will not get the votes to overturn Roe. And somebody from, I believe it was the Center for Reproductive Rights, they were speaking to a reporter, and they pointed out that the court is really loath to overturn itself unless there's a really good reason to. And you know, what struck me about that was that's absolutely true, but we are probably dealing with a president who, you know, he has flouted all the norms of politics so far. And so I I think it would be a little naive to assume that his future nominee to the Supreme Court or nominees to the Supreme Court would not also flout the norms and traditions of the Supreme Court. So Roe has survived a lot of challenges before. It has survived challenges before the Supreme Court. In 1989, there was a challenge to the Missouri preamble that laid a lot of the foundations for Casey. And some papers that came out after the death of one of the liberal justices on the court showed that the liberal wing of the court was preparing a decision to sort of decry the overturning of Roe v. Wade. So we've come really close to seeing Roe overturned before, and it hasn't been, just because that's not usually how the Supreme Court operates. But I think the fact that we've gotten that close and that you now have somebody who is probably prepared to nominate people who are really out of the norm of what we're used to seeing on the court, I mean, I think it's not hyperbole to think about Roe as in jeopardy.
I agree. I think that I have so many different thoughts about how this election will potentially affect access to reproductive health and to reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy. But I agree, as Jackie said, I don't think that we can take anything that President-elect Donald Trump says at face value. I don't think it matters really what he says. I think that the most important person to look to when we think about reproductive rights and reproductive health and other social justice issues is Mike Pence, the vice president. Donald Trump's campaign gave a strong indication that the vice president would be one of the most powerful vice presidents we've had. And I think we have, and we will continue as journalists, to look at Mike Pence's record on abortion and other issues. And he has done a lot in Indiana to erode rights to women. So I think that we're going to see even more action at the federal level. But it's also important to, for journalists and law students to look at the state level and what's going across state governments, because that's really where a lot of these laws that will come to the surface and potentially threaten Roe, that's probably where they will get their start. The other thing I'd like to mention is that President-elect Trump has been very cavalier about, maybe Roe will be overturned, it'll take a long time, people will go, women can just go to different states, whatever. But in the current iteration of his healthcare overhaul proposal, there is direct personhood language that he has already put forward, saying that any healthcare plan that he puts forward will protect patients to the moment of conception until natural death, which is basically saying, all embryos will have the rights as legal persons. So it's already embedded right there in his language, and I think, the Republican Congress will try to have that codified into law. So I think that's a big area to look at right now.
I want to echo what Sophia said about states times a million. Actually, what I want to say today hasn't changed, but the urgency of how important it is has changed tremendously. As most of you probably know, whether Roe is overturned actually doesn't have a ton of bearing on whether women in red states or the middle of the country have access to abortion. As I'm sure most of you know, Casey, which was changed in this most recent case this past summer, gave states a lot of leeway. And anti-abortion activists have been working on the state level for some 30 years to restrict access to abortion. I spent the past legislative session following what happened on the ground in Missouri, and the Missouri House passed a personhood bill 110-30 in terms of how many people voted for it. And I just cannot encourage all of you enough who are law students to take a trip to a state capitol in a place where there's not popular support for reproductive rights and just listen to how abortion is discussed. one of the major problems that we're seeing emerging as we all take stock of what happened last week is what a huge gulf there is between coastal communities or liberal cities and like the rest of the country. And there's such I can't even articulate the huge gulf between the way abortion rights are discussed in law journals, or when I speak to academics, or when I speak to even attorneys who are anti-abortion attorneys, versus the way it's discussed among state legislators. When I've interviewed state legislators, they don't understand the question. When I ask them a question about, not all of them, but multiple times, they won't have heard of Casey. They haven't heard of any court case other than Roe v. Wade. And these are people, they're probably not writing the legislation. I know, in fact, that many of them are not, but a great number of them are passing legislation. The pro-choice movement in general has focused on the federal level for a number of very worthy reasons, but they, and as we now know, the DNC in recent years have focused on the federal level to the exclusion of focusing on red states. And I can't emphasize enough how that is going to shape how abortion rights play out in coming years. And in order for abortion rights to be maintained, there's going to have to be a huge push on the state level throughout the country. And that's what I wanted to say last week, and it's what I want to say now, but there's no longer the checks. You know, when I was in Missouri in May, that the resolution that I watched, the personhood resolution I watched passed, was going to be vetoed by the governor. Now there's a Republican governor. I can't even say, President-elect Trump will be responsible for installing federal judges. He'll be responsible for installing, of course, Supreme Court justices, one if not more. So the checks on those state laws, which were being proposed for the past 5 or so years, they're going to be proposed with even more fervor, and they're not going to have checks. So that's it.
Well, that's cheering, right? So drilling it down a little bit on some of the reporting that you all have done before all of this happened, I have a question, and it may not be that everybody in the panel has an answer. We're going to have a bunch of different questions here. But I thought, let's turn to the National Right to Life Committee, National Committee on the Right to Life, has famously said that in banning abortion, it seeks to punish doctors but not women. When asked by Chris Matthews whether women should be punished if abortion were banned, then candidate now President-elect Donald Trump said there would have to be some kind of punishment. He then very quickly tried to walk that back, but it's out there now. So based on what your research and observations have brought to you, how likely is it that punishment of women will or won't be part of the banning abortion equation that's getting underway? Nina?
Punishing women. There's a lot of different ways to punish women. And yes, it will absolutely be part of the equation. The bulk of my work over last year was about criminalization of drug use in pregnancy, focusing on Alabama. And Alabama is, a test case of how bad things could be under Jeff Sessions. And I was just
Jeff Beauregard Sessions.
Yeah, exactly, right. Just joking with somebody that, the work of the rest of us is to turn Alabama more like us before it turns us more like them, and I don't know that we're quite going to do that. But what's happened in Alabama is under the chemical endangerment law is obviously the law that is in effect there. It's a law that was created to punish parents who exposed their children to drug labs. It was specifically meth labs. It was created in 2006, kind of at the height of media hysteria about a meth epidemic, although not at the height of the actual epidemic. And it was very quickly turned by prosecutors, sort of repurposed and sort of redefined so that they could sort of, instead of to punish women who exposed fetuses to drugs in their womb. And the laws in Alabama are obviously very strict. You can, just an exposure without any harm leaves you open to a penalty of 1 to 10 years in prison. If there's some harm caused to the child, you don't have to prove harm, you just have to prove exposure. You're facing life in prison. That really doesn't happen very much, but the mere fact of it is, obviously incredibly important.
And that means that a miscarriage, for whatever reason, if they're
Yes,
positive drug
if you
test.
happen to have used drugs I've heard, so the judge the Supreme Court, obviously Alabama has an incredibly conservative Supreme Court on almost every issue. They also, they happen to have an advocate, a sort of secret to most people, but not to a lot of other people, of personhood, who was a justice on the Supreme Court, a guy named Tom Parker, who basically sort of saw this law and the legal fights over whether it could be used to prosecute women for drug use, meth use in the early days, as an opportunity to do something that didn't exist, which was create sort of this jurisprudence of personhood. And so he wrote the majority opinion in a series of cases that were related to this issue of fetal rights and under the law in Alabama. And they consisted of his majority opinion, which tended to be very big majorities because this was not anything that anybody else on the Supreme Court in Alabama much disagreed with. And then his own concurrences to his own opinions. He did that 3 times, in which he kind of laid out these theories of personhood and so forth. On the one hand, he's kind of, so one of the questions that we were talking about over lunch was, well, what's going to happen to, is Tom Parker going to be suddenly in the administration, or he's a friend of Jeff Sessions? What's happened in Alabama has resulted in the prosecution of lots and lots and lots of women, at least 500, probably a lot more, according to way more. Somebody was just going up there. That was our very, very conservative count of, we looked at, I spent the last year looking at all the cases of all chemical endangerment cases filed in Alabama since 2006. So there were involving men and women in all kinds of cases. There were probably over 3,000 cases of individual defendants. And then from that, we extrapolated very conservatively that at least 500 women had been arrested and charged and for pregnancy-related exposures. And the thing about those women is that they were mostly white. 75% of them were white. They were predictably mostly poor. 90% of them couldn't afford their own lawyers. The ones who could afford their own lawyers actually couldn't, but they knew how bad things would go if they didn't find a way to scrape. So there were a lot of women who, so the poor women is actually much higher. The women who were charged were supposed to be, the worst of the worst, like the terrible. You have this, I kept hearing this over and over again from every prosecutor I talked to, the same story about the mother who's smoking meth in the parking lot of the hospital to deliver her baby. Well, it turned out at least 25% of the women had no criminal records of any kind. Meth was not the most common drug. The most common drug was marijuana. And 20% of the women who were charged with the only drug was marijuana. So 25% of people were first-time users of any, or at least first-time arrestees. And then, and in a fifth of the cases, it was only for marijuana exposure. And yet they faced loss of their children, basically huge fines. There was the bails in some counties went up to, even for a marijuana case, ranged up to $300,000. for a marijuana-only case. Additional fees and fines on top of their court costs, all of which they paid for, everything, including the cost of their own court-appointed attorneys, and the loss of their children, not just the child that they had, but the child they were pregnant with at the time of their exposure, but their other children potentially as well. And so that is very clearly one kind of punishment, but the reality is and other states have, attempted to do this kind of punishment and this kind of, not to the extent that Alabama has, obviously, but it has happened and continues to happen. I'm sure will happen more around the country. And that's just the criminal system. The child welfare system is actually the place where most pregnancy-related drug exposures end up being prosecuted, if you will, where those cases end up. And in a lot of ways, those cases are a lot harder to deal with because, as you know, the rules are very different. The court proceedings, there's often no right to an attorney. So that's one kind of abortion, that's one kind of prosecution that is both directly and indirectly related to abortion and related to women's control over their bodies. And that, I think, will continue apace as we move on.
Yeah.
Sorry to go on for so long.
No, I mean, what you said is exactly right. I mean, women are already punished for having abortions in the ways that you elaborated on. And, we think about, when we heard that sentiment, he was obviously talking about in the context of if a woman had an abortion that was illegal. But this is an area, as your comment sort of alluded to, where we've really expanded our notion of what even is an abortion. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a really interesting case that happened right here in New York that gets at this. There was a woman, she was having sort of a crisis pregnancy situation at a Staten Island hospital. She did not want to have a cesarean section, but she was not giving birth through labor. Labor had gone on for just hours and hours and hours. And so the hospital essentially forced her to have a C-section. The New York Times actually wrote it up. There's a big legal case about it. And in one of the filings that the hospital made in its defense after she initially filed her suit, the hospital argued, I believe this woman was around 24 weeks, around viability. The hospital argued that New York State's, I can't remember what gestational age ban there is. There's a 22 or 24 week ban on abortion here in New York. And they essentially argued that, well, if we hadn't forced her to have a C-section, the infant would have died. And in doing so, we would have caused an abortion. And so in obeyance of the state abortion statute, we had to force this woman to have a C-section. This was just a couple of years ago. I believe this case is still wending its way through the court. And so, this is an area where we've just really expanded our notions about what's abortion, under what circumstances does the law have a right to say what a woman can and cannot do with her body. And then just a couple of resources for this. I'm sure you guys have heard of the National Advocates for Pregnant Women. They track some of these cases. They've tracked about 400 cases where women have been prosecuted, not for having an abortion, although in some cases it's for self-inducing an abortion intentionally, but also for doing something that is believed to, whether there's evidence or not, endanger the pregnancy. And then also out of Berkeley law, there's the Self-Induced Abortion Legal Clinic, and they focus much more specifically on abortions that are intentionally self-induced. They've found about 17 cases that have been prosecuted that fit that description in the past decade or so. It seems as though, although that's a small sample size, those cases are increasing in number. And they've also identified 47 laws across the different states, although they won't really elucidate whether it's types of laws or individual statutes, because they essentially don't want to publish a playbook for anti-abortion local prosecutors, that can be leveraged to produce these sort of prosecutions, whether it's chemical endangerment or things like failing to report a body to a coroner. Old statutes that weren't passed with any intention of having anything to say about abortion or women's bodies or reproductive systems that can now be used to prosecute women, which is fascinating in its implications, and I encourage you guys to check out those resources if you're interested.
When Donald Trump was answering this question, I also think it was in the context of when Chris Matthews asked, "Do you think women should be punished?" In the context of punished legally, going to jail, or paying a fine. I think you can argue the case that currently women are punished in a variety of ways for trying to access something that in some states and in some counties is legal in name only, because it's inaccessible otherwise, especially if you're someone who does not have the economic means to travel a long distance that you would need to go to access an abortion. So I think you can definitely make that case that a lot of women are being punished right now in a variety of ways because of how many restrictions there are. But women already have been sentenced to prison time for having an abortion. One of the most recent famous cases is Purvi Patel, a woman in Indiana who had essentially a miscarriage under suspicious circumstances, and was, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the case, but it's a very bizarre case because she was charged both with having self-inducing an abortion, which is illegal, as well as feticide, which are sort of contradictory, right? She was accused of and charged with and found guilty of both supposedly committing an abortion, but also letting a child die who had already been born alive. So it's a very bizarre, complicated case, but that's definitely a very clear, direct example of someone. I believe she was sentenced to 20 years. Is that right?
I believe so. Which was reduced afterwards in the appeals court.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. I've not too much more to add. Yeah.
Okay. I would just add that to those of you who are planning to be lawyers, there is this concept of illegal abortion, and it's being applied to self-induction. The research that we've been doing in the Reproductive Justice Clinic, which is a co-sponsor of this panel, has been leading us to the conclusion that virtually all of the instances where women are being charged with self-induction as an illegal act, a sensible and appropriate reading within the sort of construction of statutory construction rules and so forth tends not to support the idea that self-induction is illegal. And going forward, as women are being prosecuted for miscarriages that are being understood or taken in certain quarters as being attempted abortion, self-abortion, more and more, I think, and we're helping support this with NAPW and also the Berkeley group. More and more, defense counsel, we're trying to educate defense counsel on that particular point, that more often than not, it's sort of prosecutors being entrepreneurial. They think they've got a situation that's, a defenseless woman who doesn't have press, management on her side, and it's a good, political move to be seen to be the vindicator of the unborn, and so a prosecution is brought. But often what we're finding when we delve into these cases is that the law doesn't actually hold up a prosecution for self-induction. And I would caution us all, therefore, to embrace the notion that until it's proven that the law, clearly does hold that up, that as to a woman's own choice about termination, not to embrace the term illegal self-abortion.
And I just want to add to that it's true that on appeal, a lot of these decisions, if there are convictions, are overturned because, especially in fetal endangerment laws, they find that the legislative intent just doesn't support ever using those laws to, it's for if you get T-boned by a car when you're pregnant. And I think what's really, really fascinating is that a lot of the things that these women are being prosecuted or persecuted for are things that are perfectly legal to do if you are not a pregnant person. And these courts find, indeed, if you are a pregnant person. And so the idea is that, in order to prosecute these women, you create essentially a new set of rules that apply to a person's body based on this, changeable condition in their body. And I think that's like really fundamentally like mind-bending to think about.
I want to agree with that, I'm sorry to add, but I also think that there's something that's going on, and it's important not to lose sight of this, that this happened in Alabama in the context of drug laws, and I think that one of the things that so one of the interesting things that happened in Alabama was that this past summer, a young woman was arrested for chemical endangerment. Basically, she'd been discovered cooking meth. She had a previous charge. She was pregnant, and she didn't want the baby. She couldn't take care of the baby. She'd already made, her onerous appointments to get an abortion, a legal abortion in Alabama. She was arrested. The prosecutor discovered that she was pregnant, and because she said, I want to exercise my right to an abortion. And he said, no, wait a second. You are going to, the chemical endangerment law, as it's been interpreted, has now sort of come full circle. And if you are going to endanger your child. We're not going to be using this sort of side language that was written, around personhood and so forth. And so they petitioned successfully to have a court-appointed lawyer appointed for her fetus. And she was stopped for several days from receiving an abortion. ACLU got involved. Like geared up. It looked like they would probably win at the federal level. But the young woman said, at that point, everybody, her family, she's like, no, never mind. I'll just have this baby. So that happened, and that's one of the sort of the side effects of these is sort of the way that they come full circle. The other thing that there was this interesting bill that went nowhere in Arizona last year. It was around legalization of medical marijuana. And there was a legislator in Mesa, a Republican and woman, who basically put forward a bill that tried to ban pregnant women from even possessing medical marijuana. And so this other thing that's kind of happening too, I think is important and not to lose sight of, is the way that sort of abortion and drug-related crimes and sort of the decriminalization of that's happening around marijuana and drugs, they really do kind of come together in these kind of really interesting and important ways. And I think that the ways that they get used as tools against each other can't be lost. And as you see, my point is that as you see more deregulation of medical marijuana and in other states, I think that we are going to see this kind of end around chemical endangerment. Same kind of thing.
So to shift gears a little bit, let's talk a bit about healthcare. Healthcare implies science and medicine and the assumption that the health of the patient is of paramount importance. And when we think about healthcare, we think about doctor-patient relationship and confidentiality of that relationship and the importance of that value. In the work that you all have done, how does that shake out?
That does not bear out.
I was going to say it doesn't.
It doesn't. Okay, so
Yeah, do you want to
talk
take it
more
away? I'll
concretely
hug the
about
mic.
that.
No, I would just say, and this gets back to the emphasis on the states, is that in each of these cases in red states where these laws have been passed, especially since 2010, which was the Tea Party midterm election, and a lot of states either went more Republican or they took both houses. The laws are, there's always testimony that this is for the benefit of the woman's health. When, there's just no data in terms of abortion and its history to suggest that it's any more risky or dangerous than so many other what have become routine procedures. And so, it's, you know, everybody knows now, they've created these, you know, you have to be an ambulatory center and have all, of, you know, the trappings of a surgical center or even a hospital, and yet, you know, a procedure like a vasectomy doesn't require the same things. Well, and so it's not about the woman's health, and you get these, and it just seems obvious that it's not, but it carries the day. And then you know, the most risky thing of all, of course, is pregnancy and delivering a baby. And
And you're not saying that ironically, you're saying that that's actually.
Yes.
No,
that's
it
true.
actually is much more dangerous to
Actually-
carry a pregnancy to term than to have a first trimester abortion.
Absolutely. Absolutely, and I just, you know, one of the things, you see these great swaths where people can't get abortions, even if it's, you know, their health or for whatever reason. And I was looking to try to dramatize just what a wide part of the country now you have to go hundreds of miles to find services. And it was really sort of hard because it was fluid, and finally somebody, maybe it was Guttmacher, somebody suggested to me that it's so bad that there's this young woman in Texas, in Austin, where I used to live, who had formed a nonprofit to subsidize the travel costs of women who were needing an abortion. And so, you know, I'd heard of nonprofits for subsidizing the cost of the abortion itself, but I'd never heard of for the travel too, and that's where we've come. And if that doesn't suggest undue burden, I don't know what does. But so I went and spent a couple evenings with her while she returned phone calls from people who were calling her for help. And this is a woman who was she's 21 years old, she was going to law school, she was pregnant with her second child. The woman is amazing. I wrote a story about her. Her story is almost, it's just what she's done. Because she became active when Texas was passing its own HB2, which was a different HB2 than North Carolina's, but there are parallels. But so she and these women had been put off by different restrictions in the law, and had gotten to the point where they were approaching the 20-week limit, which, you know, with the passing time, then you get into health problems. You know, to the extent abortion is ever risky, it's of course riskier the longer you wait. And this one woman in particular had the lines, because there had been 40-some clinics that did abortions in Texas, and it was down to, at this point, about 20, and it was in danger of going to 8, and was only in the major cities. But she was in Dallas, and the waiting list in Dallas was so long that she was going to exceed the 20-week limit. So Lindsay, this woman I was spending the evening with, wired her money so that she could get a bus to take a bus to Albuquerque, New Mexico. And if any of you have a concept of how far that is, it's like, you know, well, they always say Chicago's closer to Dallas than El Paso is. And so it's come to that. And so it just all comes back to the health. These people that are having to, there are health risks they're being asked to endure that for this, you know, as a consequence of laws that ostensibly have health as their motivation.
Yeah. I think the science part of this question is a really, really key part of it. If you want to sort of see exactly how much science counts for in some of these laws and some of these discussions, there's a great footnote in Alito's Hobby Lobby decision that you should read. Hobby Lobby, of course, was about whether or not this national chain of craft stores could basically excise the contraception portion of its health care plan for its employees. And the argument, what it boiled down to was they felt that Plan B and some IUDs caused abortions because they prevented a fertilized egg from implanting in the uterus. Now, there's a lot of new science that says they don't, in fact, prevent implantation. Science also says that preventing implantation is not an abortion because you have to be pregnant to have an abortion. And if the egg is not implanted in your uterus, you're not pregnant. However, the footnote essentially says, in the footnote, Alito essentially acknowledges that, okay, science says that they don't prevent implantation. However, the plaintiffs in this case, I believe it's called the plaintiffs in this, sorry, the Greens, the family, the Greens believe that it does prevent implantation. The Greens believe that this does cause abortion. So science versus religion, tie goes to the runner. That was my reaction when I read it. It's totally fascinating. It's this realm where, you know, people have really sincere beliefs about abortion. And, you know, we shouldn't, like, just, we shouldn't rob people of the ability to have those beliefs. But they really, I think in a lot of venues, those beliefs have sort of been given dominance over science. And, I mean, that's just an incredible example of that.
And if you don't mind, I'd like to just read a quick passage, part of a transcript from, this is from a hearing on an abortion bill that was on the first day of session in January. This bill would have required abortion providers to preserve, basically can, all embryos or fetuses that were aborted so that they could be counted by the Department of Health to make sure that Planned Parenthood wasn't trafficking baby body parts. The Missouri Senate and House spent a total of maybe 100 hours discussing this over the session. But I'm going to read this. Dr. Eisenberg, who's the head of Planned Parenthood, has just testified for about 20 minutes about the health and safety of their facility. Senator Jeannie Riddle says, "But you said it's one of the safest procedures, abortion, that it's a very safe procedure." Dr. Eisenberg, "Yes, ma'am." Senator Riddle, "I just think the babies wouldn't say that, probably." Dr. Eisenberg, "I'm an OBGYN and I frequently take care of two patients, the woman and the baby." Senator Riddle interrupts him, "I don't believe abortion is safe for the child." So this is an example of what I was talking about earlier, where the conversation that happens in, like, among attorneys is very different than what happens in state houses, where medical facts are presented literally every day over and over again, as are constitutional facts, often by an ACLU lobbyist or whoever is there. And it is not, like, I can't express enough how much no one cares. And, if you put and if you put yourself in the perspective of someone who's trying to stop a genocide, which, these legislators really either believe they're trying to stop a genocide or that their constituents want them to stop this genocide, and that is really the framework they're coming from. And they just don't listen to medical fact or legal fact. That's it.
So that sort of begs the question, to what extent the sort of struggle that we're facing is, and that you all are reporting on, is the product of fringe sort of anti-abortion activism? And to what extent it's sort of mainstreamed with core institutions in the establishment? Do you all have thoughts on that?
So again, going back to Alabama, I would say that we can sort of take a look at the crazy judge or not so crazy maybe, on the Alabama Supreme Court and say, well, clearly he's fringe. He's, part of the Christian Reconstructionist movement, that same movement that believes that women shouldn't even vote, that they should have their husbands or their fathers vote for them. But the reality of what happened in Alabama is that Tom Parker, saw a law that had been passed, and he took it. He wasn't even if you asked the legislators, they didn't maybe they had secret meetings where they sort of talked about the possibility of that this law could be much broader than was than most people thought. But it was actually prosecutors. It was DAs, very establishment who took that law and ran with it, and it was doctors and hospitals that supported, or at least did not stop that law from being put into effect, because they were complicit, actively or inactively, in secret drug testing of their own patients and turning their patients over. So in Alabama, I think that it's not, yes, the fringe is always there, trying to take advantage in the ways that you would expect, but actually that law in Alabama is very much the result of mainstream complicity by prosecutors and doctors and hospitals.
Yeah, I mean, just briefly, laws that help chip away at abortion rights, a lot of them are really popular with a huge portion of the country. Laws that ban or limit abortion after 20 weeks, which is before viability. Those poll well. Restricting wholesale the right to abortion doesn't, but requiring minors to tell their parents or get their permissions or their parents' permission before having abortion, those laws have public support, and that is something those of you who want to be in advocacy work, will grapple with.
Yeah, I agree with Nina that I don't think that there's, in many cases, much difference between the quote-unquote fringe movements and the establishment. I think a good example of this is right now in Congress. There is a panel that was set up to investigate Planned Parenthood in the wake of a series of videos that were released by like a brand new, it was, set up to do this new organization called the Center for Medical, what is it? Center for Medical Progress. And
Don't be fooled by the name.
the Center for Medical, right, going back to the healthcare science.
David DeLayden was the videographer.
He was,
Sort
yes.
of a one-man operation.
Yeah, well, it wasn't, yeah, I mean, it was
Except that he
presented
was
as a
getting
one-man.
funded by some well-heeled conservatives.
Right, and the point is that so this was this video campaign that was purported to show that various Planned Parenthood directors and clinics throughout the country were illegally selling fetal tissue for profit. And they were very successful in this campaign in terms of getting many members of the public and getting, most importantly, congressional members to believe this narrative, even though they never showed any evidence to indicate that any of it was true. But this came out of a very supposedly fringe section of the anti-abortion movement. A lot of old players were involved in this that no one's ever heard of. Are any of you familiar with survivors of the abortion Holocaust? I mean, no, not many people have heard of some of these organizations, and yet it's made it all the way to Congress, So I think that's an example. But in many cases, there's increasingly fewer distance.
If I could just, on this question of whether it's fringe or establishment, I think that's been settled years ago, and that one of our two major political parties, this is not in any way a partisan statement or observation, is on record and has been since its 1980 party platform for the first time in recognizing, that life starts at conception, and the party is dedicated to anything it can do to promote that principle. And it was very controversial at the time. Believe it or not, I was at the 1980 Republican Convention, and I was a kid, but I knew what was. Actually, I was a young woman, and it was it was heavily debated, and because the Republican Party which was at the time still, there were a good number of moderates, and women have always, or used to always, well, they still do. It's just they're conservative women, but women were a very big force in the Republican Party for years. I mean, you just look at your local junior leagues; those usually were women in the League of Women Voters. Often in, the 20th century, those were Republican women who were just civic activists. And anyway, so they put up a good fight along with some of their male allies, and they lost. And it's just become a de facto, that is a tenet of the Republican Party. And you see time after time the fights against Planned Parenthood. There's a reason for that. And the party base demands it. And so you have people like Mitt Romney and now Donald Trump who have run for president and whatever else they'll say that, especially Donald Trump, that goes against Republican orthodoxy, that is one they don't trip over. They come around to where the party is on that. So it is very much an establishment position, and I think what really came to surprise me is just underscoring just how much of a establishment position it is that with the Affordable Care Act, we've gotten into this whole debate over contraception. Mm-hmm. I was born and raised, I'm 12 years in Catholic schools. Mm-hmm. I had to, we had to dutifully fill out our little postcards to the politicians and tell them that we wanted laws against abortion, et cetera, and we did what we were told. And so now, but the idea that I would raise daughters and they would be coming of age at a time when we're debating contraception just floors me. I just cannot wrap my head around this. I thought the whole contraceptive issue was settled 50 years ago with Griswold, and that, but now it's here in terms of freedom of religion. So I think that's the area of law I'm really interested in terms of reproductive rights, because again, this ties us to the health issue too, because if the right is so interested in the health of the woman, give her access to contraceptives so she doesn't have an unwanted pregnancy, as half of them are in the first place.
Right.
But, you know, I've covered politics for a long time. I understand the arguments, again, as others have alluded here, and I respect those arguments. And I have friends who hold these beliefs, but it's the question we all deal with, and you will deal with, I hope, some of you in your careers, is whether that means it should be a matter of law or constitution.
Yeah.
So-
Oh,
yeah, I'm
do you
sorry,
mind if I
go
just
ahead.
jump in for a second? I think kind of the flip side of that to think about is what do progressives and Democrats and people in what abortion rights activists sometimes call the murky middle have done for the past 30 or so years, and sort of this question of what is, and this is a much longer conversation about journalism, but or public policy, but like what do we consider controversial, or what do we just take for granted? And I think there are more Democrats or progressives than we know that either feel ambivalent about abortion or it's really hard to rally around something you see as nuanced. I mean, I know this from my own life, where it's much easier to rally around genocide or something. And there's also tremendous stigma that we can't imagine, and I'm beating a dead horse, but there's so much stigma that we can't really imagine sitting in this room. For example, in Kansas, I spoke to an NPR producer who did not allow the only local abortion provider to become a sponsor of her program. And it was a really hard interview to do, but I understood in part where this NPR producer was coming from. She's a local affiliate, and she has to raise funds. She knows people are going to boycott her. This is not something people take for granted where she's working. And she wants to be fair and accurate, and what does that even mean? Which is a much longer, bigger conversation. But I think the point is that going forward, people who support abortion rights are going to have to somehow find a way to navigate including a very broad segment of the population into the conversation, and kind of speaking to this point of what's the difference between an existential or spiritual or whatever you want to call it point of view versus the legal questions, and how those two things, we need people who see the difference between those things to become involved in abortion rights if we're going to have abortion rights in much of the country. I mean, that's my personal belief, but.
So, folks, are there questions? Yeah. Would you stand up and yeah.
Okay, hi, I'm a 2L. I had a question. I know that a number of you spoke about the fact that the conversation that's happening in places that we're not necessarily privy to is completely different from the conversation that people are having at a place like NYU Law School. And I think that the election made that abundantly clear to a lot of people. I was wondering if you had any, I know this is kind of a big ask, but if you had any advice about ways that people who are hoping to advocate, either from a legislative perspective or from a legal perspective, ways that they might be able to speak about these issues that might be more persuasive than the ways that we talk about them within our closed environments.
I'm going to jump on that because, again, sorry to bring this back to Alabama, but so there's actually was some pretty, so when we were trying to figure out how we were going to tell this massive sprawling story in Alabama, the first story that we focused on was just there. It was this crazy judge, and I wrote the story, and probably, and it was written to a national audience, and people in Alabama sort of read it, and Tom Parker, who wouldn't talk to me for the piece, read it, and he loved it. In fact, he used it as part of his re-election materials. So the idea that I was speaking about this thing, about personhood, to this national audience, I wasn't trying to affect anything in particular with that story, except just tell people. But that was actually really important to think about, that in Alabama, calling him the most pro-personhood judge that's ever, you know, in the country
It
was kind of a badge of honor, and he wrote it to wherever he's going. I mean, I think he's still in, I don't know if he's going to, yes, he's still in the court. So anyway, so when we were trying to figure out what to do with this other project, this looking at these women who have done, you know, in Alabama terms, extremely wrong, shameful thing by using drugs during pregnancy, the question was, how do we write about it in a way that that affects any kind of change? You know, I'm not an advocate, I'm not an activist, theoretically, but I work for a news organization that likes to have impact. And what's the impact going to be, and how are we going to make impact? And I sort of thought, well, the impact is not to talk about abortion. The impact is to talk about the very other real ways that this law is unfair. That the kinds of, you know, that you could take a Valium when you're pregnant because you're incredibly stressed out and with an abusive boyfriend and fighting an abusive ex-husband, and some prosecutor or some sheriff in some random part of Alabama is going to arrest you and make your life hell and take away your kid and put you through torture and make you pay tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees for nothing. Or that you can in Alabama be using an opioid, a methadone, at under your doctor's care, like the care of a real doctor, to protect your fetus. Because if you go off methadone, you'll have a miscarriage, and or you'll have a stillbirth, and you could be arrested, and you could have your child taken away. So for us, you know, the issue ended up being about fairness, and it ended up being about who do we speak to. We decided we have to speak to Alabamians. We're not going to speak to people outside the rest of the country because we're just preaching to the converted. So we very consciously partnered with AL.com, which is a large news organization there. We wrote a story that they would feel I mean, I didn't pull any punches. I wrote the story, but that we kind of knew that the audience that we were speaking to. A couple things happened. First of all, there were like the comments, oh my God. And the other thing that we focused on was not just the women, but then we also looked at the system. So we did a separate story looking at hospitals and basically how hospitals were drug testing women without their knowledge or consent, and it included, you know, we're using these consent forms really broadly and so forth. So we did that. A couple of things happened. Doctors noticed. So once you got past that awful barrage of instant comments, doctors who had been kind of going along and not really paying attention to everything, there was a task force that was formed. They introduced legislation. It was much more sweeping than ended up being passed, but something was actually passed, a small piece of it, and that had never happened in Alabama.
And what was the legislation?
The legislation was basically to change the original legislation was to change the chemical endangerment law to ban these kind of uses of the sort of wide kind of use of the law against women in pregnancy, and one of the provisions was that women who were using prescription drugs or drugs under their doctor's order for a medicinal reason, you know, could not be prosecuted, period. And prosecutors were like against it because they don't like any sort of, for them it wasn't about abortion, it was about the ability to prosecute drug law. It was about the ability to prosecute drug crimes. And they just rode that abortion thing like everybody else does. But so a piece of it, the part of it that banned prosecuting women who were under a doctor's care for using drugs, that passed. And, you know, at the time, I called up the folks at a national organization that I will not name and for comment. And they were like, oh, well, that's just nothing. It's just sort of, you know, it just doesn't get us anywhere and blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, that's sort of true, and it's also sort of not true, because you got to start small. And you know what? A year and a half ago, nobody would have even done this in Alabama. The second thing that happened really recently, and it was just this past month, I think, in fact, and it involved a young woman who was, had been arrested for using heroin. She had been arrested during her first pregnancy. She gave birth. She got pregnant again, and she was discovered to be using heroin again. And so this was in the Birmingham area, which has not had a lot of prosecutions. And so but the prosecutor and the authorities in Birmingham decided, we are going to put this woman in jail until she gives birth, because otherwise she's going to keep using. And you know what? Her doctors were at the University of Alabama at Birmingham Medical School Hospital, and they said, and they hadn't done this before, they said, we're just going to keep her until she gives birth. We're not going to turn her in. We're going to keep her. That seems like a really small thing. That was a really big thing. Yeah. So I think that it's about who you talk to and who your allies are and how you sort of think about these issues. If you can just get beyond, that's why I come back to this thing, just like, get beyond abortion if possible in your own thinking, because in these places, if you don't, there's not going to be any change. There's not going to be any impact.
I'm sorry. I would just, for those of you who don't know, for a very, very long time, the American Congress of OBGYNs,
Yeah, I know obstetricians, gynecologists, yeah.
Has had a public position that prosecution or punishment of pregnant women for drug use is counter the public health, that it will drive pregnant women away from prenatal care, which is getting prenatal care is the best predictor. And so I just want to, for those of you who aren't sort of steeped in knowledge about the drug wars and sort of healthcare in relation to drug use, and the fact that in fact most controlled substances that are banned are not the big problem during pregnancy. I just wanted to throw out there that there has long been a policy that good prenatal care and good health care is really the way to go, and that punishment is really counterproductive. Sorry.
No, I just had 3 quick pieces of advice to your question about how best to advocate. From what I've seen both at state capitals and in Washington, one would be it goes to some respect the other side's opinion, and just even if you have to give them the benefit of the doubt that this is coming from a deeply felt spiritual, religious, wherever it's coming from, respect it. But second is, be ready with the facts. For instance, the reference to was it a state legislator who said something about, well, I don't think the fetus would call that up. Well, you might come back right away with the statistic, the data that shows just what overwhelming percentage of abortions are done at a point within the, first, 6 weeks or 8 weeks of pregnancy, when there's little chance of a fetus, being able to say anything. And third, I think this is one thing that's only sporadically and now starting to get a little more activity, and that is testimony. There have to be more people coming forward and saying they've had an abortion, or somebody very close to them has had an abortion. And I say this, to personalize things, because if I have never in my career seen any movement take off so fast and go from 0 to 60 as fast as the gay rights movement did. It was only when I was covering the George Bush, John Kerry presidential election in 2004 that one of the reasons George Bush, just to put it in perspective of how fast that issue moved, 11 or 12 battleground states, the Republican Party made sure they had referenda on the ballots that were against same-sex marriage in order to get out more of their voters, thinking that they vote against that, they'll come out to vote against that, and then they'll vote for George Bush. And so here we are 12 years later. But so why I bring that up is because one of the reasons I, among many other people, think that accounts for that speed of where that is personal experience. All the people in America, gay people who were willing to come out of the closet, and people realizing they have relatives, they have sons, daughters, brothers, sisters who are gay, and that is the single biggest reason I think that issue has come to prominence. And I think if abortion is ever going to lose its stigma, it's going to have to do something similar.
I just want to add, and I will keep this to like one sentence so we can get on to but I think another way to be really effective in advocacy is to constantly be updating and thinking about scrutinizing your own notion of who needs advocacy and be listening to new constituent groups, the emergence of the trans rights movement, which I think a lot of the issues that movement is grappling with run very parallel, healthcare access to what we're talking about here. I also think the experiences of marginalized women and women of color have not been historically very well represented in the abortion rights movement, except in smaller groups. The big legacy organizations have been very much about how privileged women experience abortion. And so just to sort of be really open-minded to and listening to who it is that needs legal advocacy.
One more question? Thank you all, by the way.
Hi, I'm Atuel. And I came a little bit late, so apologies if you already addressed this, but I've been hearing about a sort of quote-unquote abortion ship in Holland. I don't know if you've heard about this. And also ideas about mailing abortion pills to women in places who don't have access to those. And I was wondering if you could comment on sort of the legal issues involved in that.
So I can absolutely speak to this because I've written about this. There are a group of advocates here in the U.S. The group you mentioned that are on the ship, they're called Women on Waves. They are also partnered with an organization. It's essentially the same organization called Women on Web, and they do mail an abortion drug. It's called misoprostol around the world to countries where abortion is illegal. They do not ship to the U.S. because in the U.S., of course, while abortion is not always accessible, it is legal. However, there's a group of researchers who are trying to expand the boundaries of what we can do with abortion drugs here in America. Abortion drugs have always been this great promise. They're so simple to use. You can send them through the mail. If you have the proper instruction, it's sort of foolproof, not foolproof, but easy to use. And recently, in the past year, the FDA agreed that yes, we can expand the number of weeks that women are able to take this drug, so they can take it later in the pregnancy, because there's a group here in New York, they're called Genuity, that came up with the evidence to show that you can safely use this drug and effectively use this drug later in pregnancy, and you don't have to use the second course of the drug under the supervision of a doctor, one less trip to the doctor. They are now working to try to build the evidence that you can have this drug mailed. They have 2 pilot programs. One's here in New York. I don't believe anyone's used it yet. One is in Hawaii, and a lot of women on the Big Island in Hawaii, where there is no abortion facility. You have to literally get on a plane or a boat to go to your clinic, your nearest clinic. They've been mailing these drugs to these women, and they video conference with them and tell them how to use it, and it's been successful so far. But it is looking less likely that the FDA will look at this body of evidence, if indeed they come up with it, and say, yeah, we can safely do this. So the evidence is there to some extent. It's a really young body of evidence, but the evidence is there that this is not an unsafe way to use these drugs, and a lot of women are, doing that regardless of what the FDA says. But then it just becomes about, does the FDA listen to that science? Do states listen to that science?
Have you seen states try to put up hurdles to get ahead of it?
Yes, I believe 18 or 19 states have banned telemedicine abortion, so basically facilitating, a doctor sits in a room and says, this is how you take the drug, this is what you should expect. If you bleed this much, go to the hospital. And in only like a couple of those states were people actually practicing telemedicine. In 17 or 16 of those states, these were preemptive hurdles, so.
But there's also a question of the safety of accessing abortive fashions online. And so it's great if there are organizations helping and facilitating, but the desperate times call for desperate measures, and a lot of people currently are, just buying drugs on eBay without knowing what they are, what they could do.
And there's been an increased incidence of women showing up in emergency rooms having induced abortions. I forget the number, but there were 2 studies, one done on, I think it's Ohio, the other one on Texas, and there's been a spike since the 2010, 2011 years.
Well, thank you all. Does anybody know what's happened in Poland? Do we have a student who's been following the international events? Sylvia, do you have any ideas what? No? I think they tried to ban abortion in Poland, and there were, so I'm just saying that because we need to take some inspiration from folks, right?
Yeah.
Thank you all.